Yes, welcome back to the morning show on The Flow. I'm now delighted to be joined by Dr. Rowan Nicholson, who's a doctor at the Flinders University in Adelaide, South Australia. Great to have you with us during these particularly troublesome times, which the whole world is kind of grappled by right now. So firstly, I think, Doctor, it's probably best to start from the start, which is to get your thoughts on the whole invasion becoming official, because of course we did speak, you and I, off air just a matter of days ago, and you did very much predict that this was a very fluid situation and would probably change quite rapidly by the time you came on air here on Flow. So I guess now that it's official, unpack it all for us.
Yes, well, it's official in the sense that Russia is now acknowledging, and it can hardly not acknowledge, that it's using massive military force against Ukraine. The Russians, I think, would still deny that this is an invasion. The Russians will say, and Putin did say, that they're acting in self-defense in a vague way against alleged threats by Ukraine, and specifically to defend these two so-called states, Donetsk and Luhansk, in the eastern part of Ukraine, which are legally part of Ukraine but function as proxies of Russia. Now, that's a fairly flimsy argument by Russia, but at least one other country in the world, China, is continuing to refuse to call this an invasion. So it does allow Russia to present an alternative narrative of what's going on.
Yeah, it's all very interesting, and the rabbit hole goes very deep, certainly in these initial stages. Now, right now, it seems as though the world seems to be in this sort of holding pattern as it watches on. So I guess to kind of sum it all up, you can freeze as many Russian assets and pull as many Russian sponsorships and denounce as many Russian banks as you like around the world. But until Ukraine is offered genuine military support, the Russians will surely be allowed to ravage Ukraine unchecked, will they not?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons why sanctions can only have so much effect. One is that Russia has been preparing for this. Russia has been under some Western sanctions since 2014, when it last invaded Ukraine in Crimea. So the sanctions now are much more serious, but in the meantime, Russia has been preparing for them. So it's trying to do more business using the Chinese currency rather than Western currencies. It's trying to rely more on Chinese investment rather than Western investment, and so on. And it's also built up foreign exchange reserves so that it can cope with being cut off from the international financial system. So it will have some effect on Russia, but that will be limited. Another reason why they're still limited is that even now, the West has not quite hit Russia with the full force of what it could do. So in particular, some countries want to cut Russia off from what's called the SWIFT system, which is a system that we use around the world to transfer money between banks. If you cut Russia off from the SWIFT system, it becomes extremely difficult to move money in and out of Russia. So that will have severe economic consequences for Russia. But of course, it will also have some consequences for the rest of the world. For example, if you are owed money by someone in Russia, perhaps a lot of money, you may have difficulty getting it back. So there are countries like Germany that at the moment are hesitant to go quite that far.
Now, is this as much of a grab for resources from these former USSR nations as much as it is a genuine conflict born out of political tensions?
Look, resources are not irrelevant. Ukraine does have resources. It's a major agricultural country, but I wouldn't say that's the primary reason for the invasion. This is all about Russia's view of the territorial space that it believes it has a historical and geopolitical right to control or influence. Ukraine was historically part of the Russian Empire. It's Russia's immediate neighbour and stands between Russia and its adversaries in the West. It has a large ethnic Russian population, and Putin has made it clear that in his mind, Ukraine is not a real country. He is sceptical about the idea that Ukraine should even exist. So a lot of this is driven by that geopolitical view of the scope of Russian influence. And it's also driven by the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, NATO, the US and its European allies, in the 1990s, which took that alliance right up to the borders of Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania. And Russia wants to send a message to the West that that the West is starting to encroach into its traditionally Russian-influenced space. So I think it has more to do with that than with resources.
Now, that's a good segue into my following question, which relates to all the worldwide boycotts that we're seeing going on at the moment. We've never seen a European invasion during the time of social media and significant celebrity influence. So will all this be substantial, in your opinion, in, I guess, negating the drive that Russia is on at the moment to invade Ukraine? Or is a lot of it just meaningless virtue signalling? And also, if you can add on to that, is it really worth Russia sacrificing its humanitarian reputation almost entirely for the sake of, I guess, just laying claim to an extra nation?
Look, I don't think it's meaningless virtue signalling. I think there does come a point where the rest of the world needs to stand up for values, human rights, peace, international law, and you can do that in many small ways. I know, for example, there's a Grand Prix scheduled for Russia later in the year. Should we be participating in that? Should we be participating in other events on Russian territory?
Also, just to butt in there, sorry, Doctor, the UEFA Champions League announcing that the final won't be played in Russia this year either. That's a very big moneymaker too, so I guess that is quite significant.
Yeah, that's right. Now, will that have any impact on Vladimir Putin? Almost certainly not. If he's not been deterred by, so far, quite severe, as I say, not maximally severe, but still quite severe Western sanctions on the Russian banking system, I don't think cancelling the UEFA, the soccer match in St. Petersburg will make a big difference. He won't be deterred. But we're playing a long game here. Russia is challenging foundational elements of the international security system, and it will be thinking 5, 10, 20 years ahead. So the West and other democratic parts of the world will want to maintain pressure on Russia in every way possible over the coming time, I think.
So if you can, fill us in on some of the history regarding the USSR. Have Russians had long-standing disagreements with where borders were born? Obviously, we know in a sort of roundabout way the answer to that is yes, but for the average person that's sort of just listening to us out there on the fly, can you expand on that a little bit?
Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has never really accepted elements of the collapse of the USSR. So in particular, he sees Ukraine and maybe Belarus, both of which have populations that are ethnically quite close, culturally quite close to Russia. He sees those as traditional Russian territories, and he's described the collapse of the Soviet Union as a catastrophe, a disaster. So in that sense, he's never really accepted it. On the ground, he's never quite accepted it either. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been border regions in Europe and in the Caucasus in which Russia has continued to militarily occupy territory that is legally recognized as not belonging to Russia. So, for example, at the moment, we have 2 parts of Georgia that are occupied by Russia. We have a small sliver of Moldova, which neighbors Ukraine, that is militarily sustained by Russia. And we've also had these territories in Ukraine. So in particular, Crimea, which has an ethnic Russian population, in 2014, Russia annexed that territory. That is to say, they claimed to incorporate it into Russia as part of Russia. And that's continued to be a dispute. Now it's also recognized these 2 other parts of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent countries, in fact, Russian proxy states. So to an extent, this is about borders, and one possible outcome of this, though not the only possible outcome, is that Russia will try to claim more territory for itself and move the border.
Speaking to Dr. Rowan Nicholson from the Flinders University in Adelaide. Now, before we go, Doctor, you're an extremely qualified individual. And obviously this is a very significant event that's unfolding at the moment. So if you can, just talk to us a little bit about your professional background. You only joined Flinders University last year. So tell us a bit more about where you hail from and I guess your area of expertise.
I hail from here. I'm South Australian, but I did lived for a long time in the UK, where I was at Cambridge, and I also worked for a time in international law, including on cases before the International Court of Justice. So I've done writing and research in this broad area of law. And yes, I'm now at Flinders University, where I teach international law and other areas of law.
Well, Doctor, it's been great having you on and getting your thoughts about what is a very, very significant worldwide event that is developing at the moment. Thanks so much for joining us here on The Flow, and we'll have to catch up with you again sometime.
Thanks.